And I want to just start off with your take on that ongoing debate currently going on in Tanzania over the cooperation with Dubai in developing its port areas in the country. Now, similar to Kenya in 2022, there seems to be some reluctance to sign a deal with DP World. What's your take on all of this?
Thank you so much for the question. I think it's very important for us to start by understanding why perhaps the people are not sort of too enthusiastic about any form of agreement relating to port infrastructure, not just with DP World, but any other person, especially when you take into account perhaps the lessons that they might have learned from Kenya's development of the Lamu port, where over 4,000 fishers were displaced. And despite the fact that the court ruling noted that these fishers have been displaced of their source of livelihood and needed to be compensated, they still have not been compensated to date. And so if you look at Tanzania and understand the fact that when it comes to the oceans economy, for instance, over 5.3% of employment comes from tourism, which is obviously tied to the oceans and maritime sector. This is based on statistics from 2021. And then when it comes to fisheries, over 200,000 people are employed directly as fishers, and an additional 4.5 million people relying directly on fisheries, accounting to, I think, represent an estimated 35% of rural employment. So it means that potentially the people that could be affected by this port infrastructure development are a lot. And as such, people have the right to sort of have their reservation and having discussions with the government to understand whether this is actually going to be in our interest and how is our interest going to be protected. That said, as part of the development of their blue economy, Tanzania is aware of ensuring that the principles of developing or ensuring economic growth, social equity, and ecological conservations are respected. And as such, if they decide to approve this and doing it the right way by ensuring that environmental impact assessment, for instance, is done, that there's cooperation and collaboration between the different stakeholders that are likely to be affected by this, I think is actually going to be a win-win for them, because port infrastructure development is absolutely important, not just for Tanzania's intentions of being open to the global economy, but also in the context of the implementation of AFTA, wherein they can also benefit with intra-African trade within the continent.
Quite interesting, Doctor. And I just want to talk a little bit about DP World, because the firm's name does pop up a lot when we talk about port infrastructure and developing ports across the continent. So far, it has invested more than $1.8 billion in the African continent just in the last decade alone. We know it operates in at least 10 nations on the continent. What do you think is informing DP World's foray into Africa?
The thing informing their foray into Africa is the same thing that is informing investors from China, for instance, and those in Europe into investing in port infrastructure on the continent. So let's take, for instance, an estimated 90% of the import and export of trade of goods and of goods on the African continent is seaborne. Yet port infrastructure is vastly underdeveloped on the continent. As such, there is actually an opportunity for investors and people that are interested who want to tap into these opportunities for their own benefit. From the African continent perspective, with the implementation of AFTA, we need these infrastructures and facilities that would facilitate the seamless transportation of goods and services within the countries on the continent for us to actually see the successful implementation of AFTA. So whilst it might be beneficial for them because they see a gap and they want to tap into this gap, from the African continent perspective, it also presents an opportunity for us to successfully implement AFTA, so long as the right provisions are made, so long as we do not end up doing it the other way around, wherein people's source of livelihood are trampled upon in the quest of seeking economic growth alone or pursuing economic growth without necessarily thinking about the social equity issues or the potential impact of such development on the coastal economies or the environment. For instance, when it comes to development of port infrastructure in Cameroon, we saw indigenous communities that were displaced. The same story when it comes to development of port infrastructure in Lekki, which is the Lekki port in Nigeria. Although this is not directly linked to DP World, but there are so many lessons that can be learned on what not to do to ensure that Tanzania gets this right, whether or not they decide to do it with DP World or any other investor, ensuring that it is done in a way that economic growth is prioritized, but also they take into account social equity and environmental conservation.
Quite right. Now, pointing to something you mentioned earlier, aside from the business case for DP World in Africa, some have raised the thought that this could be tied to a wider national objective by the UAE to become a logistics hub and to set up here in Africa with Indian Ocean and nations. What's your take on that, especially given the fact that DP World says it plans to invest $3 billion in Africa in the coming years?
If that is the intention, if that is the objective, then the countries on the continent where they are looking to invest in should also reflect on what is the benefit for them. Like I noted earlier, in terms of the potential economic and infrastructural benefit, it can potentially be a very good thing for the African continent, especially given that we need the port infrastructure, we need the port system to work efficiently for AFTA to work. This is the African Continental Free Trade Zone or Free Trade Agreement, which has already been instituted and implemented across the continent. But for this to actually work effectively, you need to have routes to routes to transportation of the goods and services that you're trading between countries on the continent, and also then countries beyond the continent. So whilst I'd like to emphasize or reiterate the fact that, of course, no nation would do anything without necessarily protecting their national interest. And in this case, this is a company that, of course, trying to pursue the profit and economic growth. There is significant benefit potentially for the African continent, and in this case, Tanzania, if they get things right, ensuring that in the course of pursuing this potential economic growth and developing their GDP, for instance, that they do not trample on the rights of the people who already traditionally rely on the oceans for their source of livelihood, that they make the right provisions for ensuring that potential recycling of waste, for instance, if they should construct this port, there is provision for it. There's provision for ensuring that people in the tourism sector are not adversely affected by the investment. And even if they would be, that there's a consensus around what the compensations can be. And if they get this right, potentially in the next few years, Tanzania would really enjoy the fact that they are taking advantage of harnessing or their vision of harnessing their blue economy sector for the successful, sustainable development of their people and the African people at large.